Yeah, absolutely. Manu currently has a contract until 2027, but he is expected to sign a new one very quickly, which I'm sure coincides very conveniently with the fact he's now getting game time and starting for Man United under Michael Carrick. But one player who certainly won't be there next year, Ewan, is Casemiro. He's already announced he's leaving the club. Manuel Ugarte, another midfielder, the club's widely expected to be sold if the club could find a decent offer for him. So as you mentioned, they are going to need new bodies in there in the middle of the park. I wrote a piece back in January for the website looking at, 5 players that could potentially replace Casemiro. Now, this was back in January. A lot's changed since then, but I'll quickly run through who I suggested at the time. There was Adam Morton, Carlos Baleba, Amadou Onana, Aston Villa player, Angel Stiller, the Stuttgart player, and then a kind of left field option was Arthur Vermeeren, who's the RB Leipzig player who's on loan at Marseille right now, who is expected to sign for them permanently in the summer. I think a lot of those players are still quite heavily linked with a move to Manchester United, but you also did a piece very recently on the fact that Camavinga, the Real Madrid midfielder, is widely expected to leave Real Madrid, and you suggested in that piece that he could move to Manchester United because they're also looking for more bodies in the middle of the park. So a lot of names kind of thrown up in there right now, Man United linked with probably even more, but is there any kind of players that you think would be a good signing for Manchester United to not only replace Casemiro or Ugarte, but potentially just good signings in general?
Yeah, look, it's understood that they have three priority targets in that position, and it's Sandro, Tonali, uh, Adam Wharton, and Elliot Anderson. The dream signing, I think, would be Elliot Anderson. He interestingly played alongside Mainu recently for England, and I thought England lost the game to Japan, but I thought that worked quite well. He's a phenomenal player. He's English. He's a good age. He's got vast Premier League experience already at both Newcastle and especially obviously Nottingham Forest. The problem with Elliot Anderson is going to be the price and whether Manchester United can afford it. And then the bigger problem, I think, is if they can afford it, will he want to go to Old Trafford, because there will be other teams in for him. I think Manchester City are heavily linked with him as well. And as much as Manchester United are on the rise, over the last few months, it wasn't last season they finished in the bottom half of the Premier League. And if you're a top player, then I think you're going to want to go to Manchester City because, you're competing for trophies every season. You're potentially working under Pep Guardiola if he decides to stay next season. So I think that would be the dream target. Tonali's had a good season. For me, Wharton, I'd maybe not go for at the moment. I'd like to see him play more football, but there's so many players out there. You mentioned Stiller at Stuttgart. I think he's a really interesting player. I'm not too sure. You know more about him than me, but I'm not too sure if his profile and his skill set matches up well with Maino. I'm not sure he's the kind of dynamic player who's got real good legs in him as well. I think he's very good technically and things like that, but I'm not sure he fits best. And Camavinga, I think, will be available in the market this summer. As you mentioned, Casemiro's going to go. Ugarte's going to go. You need at least two central midfielders because you've only got Kobe Maino. If we're going to play a 4-3-3 and you're going to play two deep line players and Fernandez in the 10, then you've only got Maino. There's no one else at the club at the moment who can play there who's of first team quality. You've got a few youngsters who, I'm not too sure will make the grade at Old Trafford. So I think you're looking at two, maybe three players. So do you go for one big marquee signing and someone like Anderson, for example, and then you look to bring in maybe a younger profile? But I think if Camavinga's available in the market for 40 million euros, 50 million euros, I think it's a no-brainer. He's struggled at Real Madrid recently, but I think he's still a top player.
Yeah, and Man United, probably one of the few clubs in the world that can probably match the salary he's making at Real Madrid. Some really interesting points there. I mean, some people might be watching this or listening to it and thinking, well, why can't Bruno Fernandes slot in there? And I think, as you'd probably agree, Fernandes' kind of uptick in form has largely come due to the fact he's been able to kind of play that more kind of free role in the number 10 position rather than being one of the number 8s, if you will. And he's been able to kind of benefit from having Mainu and Casemiro behind him. I actually agree with you on Angelo Stiller. He's a midfielder who kind of started off as a kind of defence midfielder, box-to-box midfielder, and he's has drifted more into kind of more attacking role. Maybe not so much a number 10, but maybe like a kind of playmaking number 8. But now that I think about it, he's very similar stature and very similar style of play to Kobe Mainu, if you will. So I think I probably agree with you in that regard and saying they're maybe too similar to kind of play alongside each other, which then kind of leads me back to Onana at Aston Villa because one, he's obviously physically very commanding in the middle of the park. He's a big guy, he's very fast, more than happy to get stuck in, if you will, if you want to kind of use old cliches in that regard. But he also already has a pretty decent partnership with Tielemans at Aston Villa, who is the kind of playmaking kind of central midfielder for Villa. So he's already really kind of showed at Villa that he can play that role as, I don't want to kind of break it down to just saying he's like the enforcer, if you want, or the ball winning midfielder alongside Tielemans, because he's obviously offers a lot more than that. But to an extent, that's kind of what he does in comparison to Tielemans. So maybe Onana is the one that stands out to me of all the kind of names we've mentioned there, alongside maybe Camavinga. But Tonali's a really interesting one too, Ewan, isn't he? Because we touched on him in the last episode and saying he's one of the most valuable players who won't be at the World Cup this summer. And on the one hand, him not getting to that stage with Italy will be obviously a huge regret for him. But from a transfer market point of view, clubs like Man United might be looking at him and thinking, well, actually, that makes him even more enticing because he won't be the World Cup. We could sign him in, June. He'll get a full pre-season with us. We'll know exactly where we stand with him before the season starts, as opposed to what we often see where, a player does very well at the World Cup. They're the kind of flavour of the month. 4 or 5 clubs go for him, and then more often than not, clubs overpay for a player who's a bit of a hype man for the summer, and then they very rarely live up to that transfer fee. Or even if they do, they arrive back at team training like a few weeks before the season starts because they've been away at the World Cup all summer. So do you think if Newcastle were willing to accept a fee for Tonali, he might be a smart signing for Manchester United? Or do you think some of the other names are maybe more likely?
From the reports from reputable sources, it seems like he's a realistic option for Manchester United this summer. And his agent came out in January, didn't he? Around, I think it was Arsenal's interest. I think he probably wants to leave in the summer. Whether Newcastle will sanction his sale, Eddie Howe's been quite consistent about their kind of issues around PSR and things like that. If they don't qualify they're not going to qualify for the Champions League this season. It looks very unlikely they'll qualify for Europe again. So that's going to limit what they can spend. So it would only be natural that they'd probably have to sell a prized asset, and he's probably one of, if not their best players. So yeah, he's a player again. He's Premier League experience, which I think is important. You want someone to come in and kind of, you don't really want a project player to be your starter next season, I don't think, alongside Mane, because he's quite young. I think he might look to bring in a younger player as well, but you also want to bring in a more experienced option. I also like Boade from Lille, who's very, very talented young French player who Morocco are trying to actually get to switch allegiances for the World Cup. I think he's a huge talent. 18, I'm not too sure he's the right profile for the summer. I think if Manchester United want to build, they need slightly more experienced player in there.
And just finally, Ewan, before I let you go, do you think Michael Carrick will be the manager in place to implement this new midfield project next season?
But if anyone knows about signing midfielder, you think you'd have a good idea considering how much of an elite player he was back in the day. I think it will depend on, firstly, how Manchester United finish the season. I think it's looking increasingly likely they'll get Champions League football, which is, if you said that when Ruben Amorim left, people would laugh at you. So I think if he gets that, he's got a really, really strong chance. Also, look, it depends on who's available in the market as well. If Luis Enrique decides, look, I don't want to stay at PSG, I want to come to the Premier League, then I'd go and get Luis Enrique. But if there's not a real star candidate, and I don't think there is, at the moment, looking at the names about, Nagelsmann, I think, has got lots of admirers at Old Trafford, but will he stay with Germany? And again, the problem with bringing a manager in who's, say, Nagelsmann, for example, who's at the World Cup, is they're going to cut back halfway through pre-season, and it's not ideal at all. I know they can still do work behind the scenes and things like that. So I think Carrick's got a strong case. Personally, I would look at the market and see who's out there and who's potentially interested. Like I said, I think Luis Enrique would be the dream candidate, but yeah, I think he'll probably stay at PSG. So yeah, there's every chance he could be, and obviously that'll affect transfer business as well. Obviously, you need to have a recruitment team now. It's not as if it's Erik ten Hag signing all the players he knows from the Netherlands anymore. So they'll still do their business behind the scenes, and with kind of Christian Vivel and Jason Wilcox and the recruitment team there. So yeah, in a long way, I think he's probably the favourite at the moment.
Yeah, It'd be really, really interesting to see what they do with Carrick, because, as you said, he's barely put a foot wrong so far, and Champions League football looks more than likely, which should help them in the pursuit of new midfielders.